Good evening. Welcome to the Planning Commission for Wednesday, June 28th, 2017. We will begin tonight with a prayer by Mr. Jones and the Pledge of Allegiance by Mr. Smith.
Father in heaven, we give thee thanks for the blessings that we enjoy in this country. We thank thee for the privilege of living in Provo. We pray that thou would bless us as we discuss matters of importance to the city, that we would have thy help and make wise and judicious decisions. We pray for those who serve the city, the first responders and the city workers. Please bless them and keep them safe. We pray in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Please rise for the pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you.
Thank you both. We will be hearing 5 items this evening. The items that are marked items 1 through 4 on our agenda require public hearing and legislative action by the municipal council. So the Planning Commission will be making recommendation on those items to the municipal council. The remaining item 5, which does not have an asterisk, will be approved or disapproved by the Planning Commission this evening. And we'll start by asking each of the commissioners to state their name and whether they have any conflict of interest this evening.
Dave Anderson, no conflict.
Deborah Jensen, no conflict.
Edward Jones, no conflicts.
Brian Smith, no conflict.
Okay, then our first item for this evening. Item 1, Provo City Economic Development Department requests an amendment to section 14.38.105, parentheses 1, to increase the amount of signage permitted in a multi-tenant building in the downtown, ITOD, downtown gateway, and west gateway zones, and this has citywide impact. And Aaron Ardmore will be presenting that item tonight.
Thank you. So just a little bit of background on this one. It is submitted by our Economic Development Department, who within the last year, you may have remembered, went through our downtown sign ordinance and made a bunch of changes. What they didn't do was to address large buildings. Downtown, there's a couple examples of some of our larger buildings. These are buildings that commonly have different tenants on the upper floors with no separate entrance, and they were looking for a way to advertise as well. So as those should be, the thought was those should be treated a little bit differently than buildings that are maybe 2 or 3 stories tall. So the ordinance amendment that was brought forward and worked with community development staff to get this was tenant identification signs. So initially, or currently, each building, no matter what the height or anything, gets 1 sign for however many tenants are in that building. The proposal is to separate that out. As you can see, for buildings 2 to 4 stories in height, they'd still just get the 1. But for taller buildings, 5 stories or higher, they could have 2. That could satisfy current requests coming in to the city for wall signage on those buildings. So staff helped economic development with this language and supports this proposal in that it would help economic development of the city and provide jobs and so forth. So we support this proposal, and I would take any questions you have.
Thank you, Mr. Ardmore. Would anyone on the Planning Commission like to ask any questions?
Go ahead.
Mr. Smith.
Thank you. Yeah, just two seems like not very many. I mean, it's just one more than one. I can just see this coming back in future years where you've got multiple large tenants in these high-rise buildings, high-rise to Provo, and saying, we all want one. And then what do we do there? Going back to the elevations, the pictures of the buildings, I'm just kind of curious what we're looking at. If we're adding just one more sign, does the Zions Bank sign count as one and the Wells Fargo sign count as one? And then they're allowed one more sign for another tenant in there?
So those are building identification signs. Those are under a different section in the sign code. So the Wells Fargo and Zions Bank are under a different section. So they could each both have two tenants put wall signs on. The reason it was limited to two is I think there needs to be a line somewhere. We don't want a wall sign on every floor of a 8-story building, and it gets to be a little overbearing.
Right now, they just put them in the window, it looks like. Okay,
Yeah, that happens.
thanks.
Okay, Mr. Jones?
The question was answered.
Any other questions at this time? If not, we'll turn it over to, is anyone here from Economic Development?
I'm sorry, just walking in. Aaron, is there anything more that, as far as from staff or planning commission, that just trying to promote some of our local businesses in downtown, recognizing that there's limited opportunities at times. And I think Aaron said it right. You gotta have to draw a line somewhere, and felt that allowing something a little bit more would be acceptable or reasonable. And yes, at some point there does need to be a line drawn, and we're comfortable with this and hope to accommodate the end user.
Maybe a question, maybe a comment, just relative to, for me, the Wells Fargo and Zions Bank buildings are a little bit different. I know Wells Fargo has a couple of tenants. They're street level, man doors directly into that space. There's a little bit more of that in the Zions Bank building.
Yes.
This might go sort of along the lines of what the other commissioner said. For example, I think that's just a banner now.
Yeah.
But for me, it's not necessarily distasteful at all, at least potentially if the signage is designed the right way.
Oh, all banners are distasteful, but
Well, sorry, I'm getting some signage that, maybe is on that kind of scale for the different spaces.
yeah, and I think that's probably an old picture, because I think the current situation is, as you go, there is actually a sign. Is that correct, Aaron? That there's
Yeah,
signage?
so if you go by there now, each ground tenant with their own entrance has a wall sign, and that's permitted. If you have your own entrance off the street, you can have your own wall sign.
Got it. So this only applies to floors 2 through whatever, is that
upper levels.
what I missed?
And again, certainly, even economic development wants to promote. Businesses would say, we probably can't have a sign for every single tenant in the building. And again, I think it's reasonable to draw a line someplace, and that needs to be maybe more than one, but less than some big number out there.
What if we attach that number to tax revenue?
Yeah, there's probably a lot of ways we could do that, but anyway.
Any other questions for the applicant? Mr. Jones?
Representing economic development, do you have an issue with the signs being limited to two? It would seem like these two examples here, these buildings really have three sides to them.
Well, so the interesting part about these is you're right. They actually have obviously four sides, but three sides face commercial areas. And the
That's what
fourth one being the residential.
They have three faces.
Yes. And again, without going crazy or asking for too much, I mean, again, we get that you can only come to the well so many times. Mm-hmm. And then there is at some level when it becomes kind of over the top, and I think we're trying to find some balance. And frankly, there may be a third one out there that comes and says, oh, but what about us? And it's like, hey, I guess you can take your chances, but at some point there starts to be too much signage for a community standard, and so we get that. And so right now, just because we're facing what's in front of us, it's the second one. I would say probably 2 is fine. Now, I hope to not come back next month for the third one, but at some level, you have to say, hey, we've kind of reached the limit on what's acceptable. And I don't know if that's would be up to, and that's the beauty of a planning commission who can be dispassionate about it. And I mean, eventually, obviously, this is going to go to the municipal council for more of a political decision or whatever, but the planning commission has the ability to step back a little bit and say, hey, what's prudent and what's reasonably acceptable for a community.
Well, now that you've made the trip to the well, do you want to get your bucket full and go ahead and ask for 3?
I don't know. I would defer to the planning commission or the planning staff. I mean, I get on a multi-tenanted building, but even in larger cities that have taller buildings than this, again, you don't see a sign for every single tenant. Mm-hmm. And there comes, and I don't, know where that line is. It starts getting fuzzy between enough and too much.
Got to call who your anchors are, really.
Yeah,
honestly.
yeah. So a marquee sign on the top is pretty common. A mid-level sign someplace else is not uncommon. Beyond that, I don't know, Bill, any or Aaron, any thoughts on that?
Directory signs at that point, I think, would be more appropriate as you're in front of the building, having a directory sign for each level. But it could be another discussion.
Okay. But I appreciate you asking the question and allowing for that conversation. And again, at some point, it then becomes representing the community standard, of which the planning commission obviously has an opportunity there, but ultimately the councils, if they say, hey, no, we need more signs, then okay, or no, we've got enough, or something in between.
Mr. Anderson?
Thank you. So is this the sign that we're talking about for the Wells Fargo building, the one on the corner?
No, it's not being shown. So these are just examples of buildings that this would apply to.
Okay, so I'm just trying to get some kind of understanding. So they haven't taken advantage of the opportunity, at least with what we're seeing in these images, to make use of the
Even
sign
one.
for Wells Fargo.
Yeah, Wells Fargo is the only business advertising on their building at this time.
Right.
Yeah.
So the actual person that would be, or group that would be putting up a sign is the Daily Herald.
Okay.
So they would be putting up a second sign on the building, but it's referred to as the Wells Fargo building, but.
Actually, I'm just trying to get a feel for scale. So it looks to me like this is maybe 6 by 6, give or take, something like that. So 36 square feet. We're talking about 50. So not a lot larger than that. That's pretty diminutive still. That's not having a big visual impact, which I think's great. But I'd be fine, maybe, with the idea of accommodating another tenant with just leaving it up to 50 square feet, that if the building owner wanted to divide between one tenant, 2 or 3 or something like that, and just talk about copy area, period.
Okay.
And if that, just make it a little bit more flexible in that regard.
Yep.
Mr. Jones?
Just for clarification, and maybe Aaron can answer this. This really doesn't apply to, for example, the Wells Fargo sign or the Zions Bank, because that's identifying the building. Is there a difference between
That's partially true.
talking about, or does that apply to the identification of the building?
So what you can see on Wells Fargo, what the problem was, is they have multiple signs. So they're allowed one building identification sign, which you're using here. Mm-hmm. And this took up their tenant identification sign. So that's what spurred this
Okay,
proposal.
so that's their one.
Yeah.
Gotcha. That's helpful.
The corner one then is what is that?
The corner, I don't know if that'd be classified as a projecting sign. I'd have to get out there and look at it. I wasn't around when those signs went up or were approved.
Could have happened in the middle of the night.
I mean, if you look at it, there's 5 signs there, well, or 6. There's the 2 over the entrances. There's the 2 at the very top. street facing, both of them. And there's the one on the corner projecting west and north. So I don't know what the classification is as far as signs go, but obviously you're saying there's just one that they're using over the entrance.
Yeah, and those signs honestly are legally non-conforming. All those were in before this sign code was amended for downtown.
Okay,
So now we're looking at what we can do in the future.
gotcha.
Right, any other questions? If not, thank you. I'd like to invite any neighborhood chairs that are present that would like to comment on this matter. See no one. Any neighborhood or residents who would like to comment on this matter? If not, I'll turn it back over to the Planning Commission for further discussion and/or a motion.
I'll make a motion. I would move that we would forward a positive recommendation to the municipal council on item number 1.
I second the motion.
Thank you. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, so we will forward a positive recommendation to municipal council for item number 1, and that was unanimous. Okay, item number 2. David Gardner requests an ordinance amendment to allow accessory dwelling units attached to an industrial use in the manufacturing park MP zone. This is in the River Grove neighborhood, and Austin Corey will present this.
All right, thank you. You've heard this item a couple months ago. The applicant originally had proposed adding a land use number for attached accessory units into the permitted uses category. The item was continued at that meeting after receiving some comment and asking the applicant to go back and revisit his proposal. Just to give a very brief recap, there's 3 areas that are currently zoned MP, or manufacturing park. This area, which is along 820 North, it's the area that you see in purple, outlined here. And then 2 additional areas, one along 2230, which is the Mega Diamond facility, and then there's a printing facility on University Avenue just before you enter the mouth of the canyon. So the changes that have, well, this is the original text that was proposed. Like I mentioned, it had some caveats about the dwelling unit being accessory and things like that, but it was listed under the permitted uses category. The applicant made some proposed changes, and planning staff made some recommendations to that text as well to ultimately result in the language that you see before you right now. But in essence, in short, what's changed since you last heard it was to move the allowances down into the accessory uses category, which would automatically make it obviously accessory at that point. So it limits the square footage and things like that just by the nature of moving it to that category. The other more key changes that have been made is there's a list of standards that a unit would have to meet in order to be able to be allowed to add that accessory unit. Those that are listed here are the family. It would be limited to family occupancy only, so they wouldn't be able to do batching singles. The allowance for attached is already part of that, but it would have to have an operating and permitted commercial or industrial use at the time. Another really big one, and this was one that was discussed pretty heavily at the meeting a couple months ago, was possibly a distance. The Planning Commission had made a recommendation that there be a buffer distance from residential zones. And determining what that number was, the applicants proposed 500 feet, and I'll get into that in a little more detail after this, but they have proposed that there be a buffer distance from any residential zone where this allowance wouldn't be permitted within that buffer. Then planning staff made some suggestions for adding some things like open space requirements once you get to a certain number of units, making sure there's pedestrian connections to the street if the units are in the back, some things like that. So the 500-foot buffer zone, this is just a quick graphic. So the other two zones that we mentioned are actually narrow enough that they wouldn't permit that. If this 500-foot were one of the restrictions in there, they would automatically not be allowed to add this. The line that you see there in red, the areas to the east and the north would be restricted from allowing accessory units. So the allowances would then end up basically just in this area, and then a very small portion back here, which that portion's developed currently at the moment anyway. But in essence, that's the changes that have occurred, and we do have the previous drawings that were shown and things like that that were discussed earlier if you need to reference those, but that's all that I have for this presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Corey. Planning commissioners, any questions for Mr. Corey? Mr. Jones.
Going to page 9, the paragraph V, or 5, on line 31 through 34. Being in acoustics myself, I'd like to comment on that. An acoustical engineer is not a real term. It's not a valid title. There is no licensing required for practicing acoustics. It's not like structural engineering or electrical engineering, one of the other disciplines. There's no license involved. And best practices is really a nebulous term in acoustics. It's not very definitive. It would be in one of the other engineering disciplines. What I would suggest instead of this verbiage, I would indicate the goal, which is to meet the city ordinance regarding noise levels and vibration levels.
Yeah, thanks. That primarily, that language exists right now in our ITOD. And so that's primarily where that language came from, and then modified obviously to fit these circumstances, but.
I would reference the city ordinance that gives a specific dBA level.
dB level.
I don't know what that is, but it's in the code.
Yeah, it'll be under, I believe it's chapter 6.
And maybe you just add a phrase that says that it shall meet the code, or maybe you don't need to say that if it's already codified.
Mr. Anderson.
As I'm reading, it's point number 2 under F, there on page 8, talking about the accessory nature of the dwelling units. Is that intended to mean that it's basically live workspace, to where the units ancillary or accessory to a particular business space or just accessory to the whole development?
Well, that restriction basically prevents a standalone apartment building from being created. It actually requires the unit to physically be attached. So,
But not necessarily.
yes, it's live work, but it's not. It could be that there's an operating business, and it may or may not be the actual owner of the business that's living in the unit, but in essence, it's a live work unit, yes.
The unit will be attached to a non-residential unit, and the idea is that,
Correct,
they're
and this would
connected.
prevent any standalone units from just being created. what we wanted to be careful of was a commercial structure sitting out on a corner and then a whole bank of apartment buildings being built behind it and being justified under that. So
Any other questions? If not, I'd like to turn it over to the applicant, Mr. Gardner.
My name's Dave Gardner. I'm at 724 North, 1890 West in Provo. We've been working with the staff. We had a neighborhood meeting. We had quite a bit of input from neighbors that were further away. They were concerned with parking and some other issues. And there may be some here tonight to address that. But basically, the issues that in the amendment and the changes the staff has recommended, we're in agreement with. So, any questions I can answer?
I do have one question, and it's the 500 feet. It seems like that really, really limits. I know that when we first heard this, we talked about spacing as far as height being away from neighborhoods that might kind of overshadow a current neighbor or something like that. Looking at the red line, that gives you a very limited area to use.
Yeah.
And you're okay with 500 feet then?
Yeah, the only disappointment is we had this property right in here is owned by Provo City, goes right down to the river, and the city was willing to sell us that property, but it's in the 500 feet, and that was with the trees that are there, there's no other trees there, but with the trees that were there, we felt like this could be a really cool little place to put some of those accessory units. So we ended up not exercising our option on that because that's 500 feet wipes that out. But that's the price we're willing to pay to, what we didn't want is to have a lot of neighborhood opposition with the neighbors up in Grandview and in Castlebrook because they don't need the stress of having something that they didn't want in their neighborhood.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Gardner? If not, thank you. I'll turn it over to any neighborhood chairs that are present that would like to speak to this item. No neighborhood chairs? Any members of the public who would like to speak to this item? And please state your name and address when you come forward.
Camille Chipman, 836 North, 1760 West. So that is here in Park Ridge. I also have property here. So I was one of the neighbors concerned, and I feel like this 500-foot buffer eliminates my concerns. So I'd be in favor of it.
Great, thank you.
Hello, I'm Dave Rosen. I am a neighborhood chair of the River Bottoms neighborhood, and we appreciate the efforts to do the 500 feet that excludes the piece of property that is in the River Bottoms neighborhood. However, this evening I'm mainly here as a property owner and representing a property that is that piece right there. And I feel it inappropriate that this little sliver be left in the major MP zone. This piece right here takes into effect one of my buildings on my property, takes into effect another, but most of all, it leaves a little piece for an open area right there that is currently raw ground that somebody could step in and build and put one of these units in the middle of this whole park that I think is inappropriate. Now, I understand the efforts to keep it 500 feet away from residential areas, but there should have been some leeway to take this piece right out of it so that it's not part of this zone. I think they're really interested in this down here. So if you want to make a trade, get rid of this, give them this, and we'll all be a lot happier. And so I'm not in favor of it the way that it's written right now. We as a commercial piece of property prefer not to be lumped into that area. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rosen. Any other community members who would like to speak to this item? If not, shall we turn it back over to the commissioners for discussion? Any comments, questions?
I'll dive in. We talked about this a couple of months ago, mentioned that a minute ago. When we first talked about it, I thought of a few things that, in my mind, really made it a bad idea. And since then, I've thought more about it and thought of some other things that, in my mind, were concerns about just sort of the overall concept. But, really, with the 6 different items that are mentioned on page 2 of the staff report and they're in the proposed ordinance language, I think all of my concerns have been addressed. So we would see a project plan before anything. I'm kind of interested in just sort of seeing how that works, how it looks, just exactly what the arrangement of the different units is going to be and that sort of thing, so.
Any other comments? Mr. Jones.
Well, I think Mr. Rosen raised a question, and I'd kind of like to hear the answer. Not sure who can answer that.
I would just say that if the Planning Commission is open-minded to staff looking at Mr. Rosen's suggestion, just express that in your motion. I'm not sure if we'll be able to come up with a tool to accomplish what he has in mind or what he suggests, but we'd like to try that. My point really is that you give the City Council the opportunity to make an adjustment like that if we can figure out a way to do it without it having to come back to you again because the City Council's made a tweak that you didn't get to see, and some may think that you need to see that. So if you would just kind of head off that question or that issue by expressing your opinion of Mr. Rosen's suggestion, I think that would help us.
Thank you. Mr. Jones. Mr. Smith, sorry.
It's kind of the same, isn't it, Smith and Jones? I think that Mr. Rosen's concern could be addressed if things were to come forward on an individual basis. That could be managed that way. Also, I think that this little tail down on the what is that, the southeast side of that could also be addressed through an application for kind of a non-conforming use or something, if he were to want to use that. I just think that there are mechanisms to do that and still get it in, I'm guessing. So I'm inclined to leave it at 500 feet. I think 500 feet was a lot, but it accomplishes what we're trying to do. But I think there are other ways to manage not building north and potentially building south, if I'm not mistaken.
Any other comments from the commissioners? If not, I'll look for a motion.
So relative to the 500 feet, honestly, I'd be comfortable seeing that modified. I understand how the neighborhood feels about it and like to be respectful of their concerns. But having the residential uses close to new residential uses hasn't been a big concern of mine. If that was reduced to 400 feet, would we still be addressing their concern and the one that was raised tonight? Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I don't know how much space that gives us on the south end. If we go to 400 feet, it'd almost be neat to see a graduated, 400 feet line, a 300 feet line, see what that looks like. But
yeah, we did study a lot of that. 300 feet is primarily the number that would allow all of that property to become developable, but then it opens up that door in the middle.
So what do you mean by all the property? Because
So 300 feet would basically create a line that ended up right about the level of the Provo River right here. So the rest of that property would then be opened up. But then it would also open up and kind of further perpetuate some of the issues that Mr. Rosen raised. One of the things that we have done in some other zones or allowances that are in other zones is we have a strict line requirement, like say 500 feet, but we have an allowance that the Planning Commission can vary that. They can grant an exception to that 500 feet as part of a project plan approval. That could be a way of keeping that hard line in the sand so that it's out there and it's pretty definite what it's going to be. But in a case like this one where it's fairly innocuous and it just happens to be, what's interesting about this piece is that residential zone is actually a public park. But again, by trying to find a tool to achieve what we were doing, it was almost collateral damage. But we could write in just a caveat at the end of line item F3. So it would say accessory dwelling units shall not be permitted within 500 feet of a residential zone boundary unless approved by the Planning Commission as part of a project plan application or something similar if you're looking for an allowance or an exception in that regard.
I like that.
How would staff feel about just residential use instead of residential zone? Would that be any more?
That would take
We don't need to
the
make
It starts to make things a little more tricky.
Okay, got it.
Especially when you're talking about areas that might have non-conforming uses and things like that. The zone boundaries are a lot cleaner line.
Okay. I move that.
Mr. Anderson.
Okay. I move that we recommend approval of the proposed ordinance amendment associated with item number 2 on the agenda with additional language under F3 that would allow for the Planning Commission to grant an exception to the 500-foot residential zone buffer at the time that project plans are approved.
Second.
Second by Mr. Jones.
Smith.
Mr. Smith, sorry.
Sorry.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay, we will then, Planning Commission will forward a positive recommendation from the Planning Commission to Municipal Council for item number 2, and that was unanimous. Okay, our next item, item number 3. The Provo City Community Development Department requests an amendment to subsection 14.10.0803 regarding street side yards on corner lots. This has citywide impact and will be presented by Mr. Maxfield.
If you recall, some time ago, there was a proposal to change the front yard and rear yard requirements. That was approved by council in the end. And it kind of got changed as we went along. It made it so that you no longer have to have the 50-foot combined yard if your lot is 113 feet or less in depth. What it also did was change the front yard to a common measuring point. The point being either 14 feet behind the sidewalk or 23 feet behind the curb, whichever is further into the property. As we went through that and got toward the end, we realized there's a setback on side streets that kind of referred to the same thing as the front yard. And so what we're proposing, because it wasn't in the same section, we couldn't really deal with it, but proposing to change the side street to mirror that would be required on the other lots. One thing, you notice we had 2 exhibits in there. One dealt with side street corner lots, and it crossed out that shall not be used for vehicle parking except such portion as devoted to driveway use for access to garage or carport. When you get into definitions, sometimes they get cumbersome if you start putting regulations into them. And really, that's more of a parking issue, and so we thought, well, you can take that out. The intent was to eventually get to a point, and this was kind of the alternative one, because we have had instances where there's parking inside properties, and thinking about it, we thought, well, it is providing more off-street parking, and isn't that a benefit if it's not too cumbersome, if it's somewhat screened? So we threw in a screening clause, And just to kind of give you some examples of some of those corners, the first one area is up on Tentview Drive, and this one on the right is actually north of this one on the south. But you can see they put a fence around here. This is a solid fence on their corner. So really, in essence, this becomes screened from that side property line. The one on the opposite side, they haven't done anything yet. This was actually the CO for this, and this one couldn't be signed at the time just because of the side yard parking, where it's required that the parking lead to a garage. You can't just kind of put it out there, even though it's very common through the city. So, there'd be ways to address situations such as this. We have other examples. This one's a through lot where they kind of have side parking. There's actually a hill that goes up in this area. And so, is it really visible, their access into their garages this way? The one here shows where they've had two access points where it's permitted because it's not uncovered, but you say, is that any different than someone parking in the side yard? And then this one further up on Canyon Road, where they've got a side yard that's fenced off, and you could drive through here and park over there and still be screened. What we'd really like to get to tonight is maybe just recommending that first portion, the one with everything crossed out dealing with parking, and then bring this other issue back as a separate item that would be in the parking standards that might look for this kind of treatment, and really look, as you maybe discuss this, come up with some ideas or thoughts on that. Or is it something you favor or you have concerns about? This case, there are some cases where someone could go back there and park 5 cars, and we say, well, should it be limited? That, yeah, you can put 1 or 2, but you start making a parking lot out of it may be a little excessive. But just some parameters that way that you might want to think about. You can discuss them tonight, or you can just have that on and bring it back you can wait until we bring it back as a separate item. So what we recommend tonight is that you, sorry, I had heavy finger on here. Really look for this one, and then if you could make a motion too that says you would be interested in looking at the other one, that would at least start the process and really kind of make it pending legislation if you wanted to do that. Any comments?
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Maxfield from the commissioners? No questions. I'd like to invite any neighborhood chairs present to speak to this item. Any residents wishing to speak to this item? And please state your name and address for the record.
Sure. Melanie Dunsley, 3056 West 1010 North. So I'm just looking for a little further clarification. A lot of the pictures that were presented have people parking on that side lot where there's a garage next to it. But what happens if the garage is on the other side? Will people still be able to park on that side? And is it, I understand the 75 opacity, whatever, does that include as you're driving through, there'd have to be a gate that closed behind the car? Or, I have questions like that. Just further clarification.
Those are very good questions. That is something that I think we need to, oh, sorry, I did this again. Did I go the wrong way?
Yes, you're going the wrong way.
Okay. Happy clicker tonight. How did I do that? Oh, I went really the wrong way. You want to click on that? I think I clipped the up, yeah.
And while you're doing that, what is the mark for how long the yard is? What is that dividing point? Did I hear 113 feet?
Yes, 113 feet where you'd have to have the combined. This is a very good question, one which we've actually thought about. We said, Okay, what if the garage is
Right.
maybe on the right side of the home, and you've got parking there? Could you then park on the left side also, if that's what I understand the question to be? That's something that I think we want to have a discussion. Doesn't mean you suddenly get to have driveways on both sides of your home. I think we're trying to shy away from that and try and keep it all on one side if possible. Certainly, we've got the other example, like a corner lot, where you could do that. I think we're thinking the interior lots is where it would be kind of strange, because then we're adding extra drives and other things up and down the street. A corner lot may not be as critical if you had, you could access two sides. If I know on certain streets, engineering is trying to cut down the access points on the major collectors. So, that may be something we need to look at more closely. The other one dealing with the screening that would be required. Let me go back. Oh, okay, left and right. Oops, I went too far. This is a good example here where we felt you wouldn't necessarily need to screen it from the front as much. I think it was more from the side street. So we were saying, or at least our initial thought was, you would not have to have a gate or solid fencing across there. You'd be able to, just park in there and keep it open. It's really that side view, I guess. Another one that came up was, what about RVs? Because they're fairly tall, and how do you screen them? Part of that was the coverage requirement that would allow those over there, where someone may have to just plant taller trees or bushes or shrubs or something to break it up a little bit more. Did that kind of get to your question? I don't know we've got a solution yet, but it's a good thought.
Right. As I was rereading through this, you can't park on the street unless it's a permitted driveway with a garage or carport. So it's not like if they don't have a garage or carport on the other side that they can just go ahead and park there, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, let me go to that other one, I think. Which one was the better example, I guess? You mean this one up here? This one shows that if you had a garage, you could park, and technically you could park in the front because you've got a driveway. So you
Right,
could park in
anyways.
those spaces.
But you could, for instance, in this situation, could they go ahead and then extend that driveway over so they could park more to the side of the garage on this side?
Over to the north?
The down.
The
from
south you
Portola?
couldn't, and that was the, I guess, the decision not to have any more going to the front yard and close off that way. So it would have to stay in front of the garage or to the side property line. Now, one of the other things we're trying to get away from regulating somebody paving 30, 50 feet of their front yard, going all the way across, that you would, and that's kind of what we're saying, if you had, several cars over here and you had a drive cutting all the way over there, you could get fairly extensive on the pavement. And I think there was some concern that there's still some limitation as to what the ultimate width of that may have, or may be allowed to be. So yeah, it gets into some real nuances that I think we need to look at and say, how does it apply here versus here? Why does this work and okay, but this one doesn't? And probably give a lot more examples around town of some of the situations.
My other question is if this ordinance is approved and with the front yardage that was recently approved, does that allow people to extend property building, adding on into those areas that are now not required as front and side setbacks?
Or the front and rear yards, where it used to require the combined 50 feet.
Right.
Yes, now they could do an addition up to, which is basically a 20-foot and 20-foot setback.
But that in effect switches the allowable buildable area. It kind of
It
larger,
increases it, right.
Okay.
And I should mention also, I forgot to do that, there was also a caveat put in the allowance that allows you to go to 15-foot setback if you have 400 square feet of your building. So, even in the backyard, you could, say you had a 30-foot setback now, you'd be able to add on 10 feet plus 100 feet could extend another 5 feet into that setback. So the rear yard's certainly more open, I think, than the front, but the front for people that were already set back 30. In fact, we have an example, maybe one of our first ones coming in, that they're adding onto their front, a porch and that, which they wouldn't have been able to do before.
I see. Okay, thank you, I appreciate it.
Great, thank you. Any other comments? Questions? I'll turn it back over to the planning commissioners then for discussion and a motion. Mr. Smith?
Maybe just a question for planning staff. So you mentioned, along with the motion on this, the possibility of adding to the motion, that we are interested in looking for future research on, and then what was that specific?
Right, in that you're deleting this section out of the definitions. Your intent isn't to create necessarily the allowance for parking or an unregulated, but to look at putting it in the proper location in the ordinance, or more proper location in the ordinance, and better define what those situations would be, or something like that. Is that too wordy?
I'm not sure that's anything I can work with. Let's see. You know, I'd be happy to.
So this is again, the one that we would say, this is one we recommend approval on.
Yeah, okay,
We don't need a motion on that. We need a motion on that.
Right.
okay,
So just Exhibit A.
yeah.
With the idea that we're going to come back and address the other issue, is there a reason to not, is there a potentially pending item out there, something like that, that would make it so that we take it in, the different iterations instead of just waiting and doing it at once?
No, some of the ones we showed, like I say, we have not been able to issue their COs to because they were in violation technically. Whether or not that's
a good reason to act then. Okay. So I move that we recommend approval of the Exhibit A as described in the meeting tonight. That's it?
Item 3.
Yes, associated with item 3.
Second.
Second by Mr. Smith. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
No opposed, so we pass item 3 with a positive recommendation to municipal council, and that was unanimous. Right, item number 4. The Provo City Community Development Department requests an amendment to Chapter 14.06 and subsection 14.10.090, parentheses 4, regarding patio roofs and their extension into a required setback, and this would have citywide impact. And again, Mr. Maxfield.
This item's also a clarification resulting from the recent change on front and rear yards. Currently, there's an allowance that says a patio can extend 12 feet into a setback. If you have a 20-foot setback, that could go within 8 feet. The council had the concern that with the other allowance for the 5-foot extension for 100-foot, and I do have a kind of an illustration there. This is kind of what it would be now, in the sense that you've got a patio that extends from a home. I'm sorry for the crude drawing, but I think it kind of illustrating the point. So you still have like an 8-foot yard back there. The concern was if you had this 100-foot extension that went out an additional 5 feet, this now becomes a 3-foot setback rather than an 8-foot setback. And so their intent was to really not let that happen, so it was to create an absolute 8-foot distance. And then in doing so, also, I'm really having trouble, do 2 other things: define what a patio is, because there were confusions that a patio couldn't extend. Really, it was a patio roof. It wasn't a patio. Patio is a flat surface and isn't regulated that way. And so we created the definitions for patio and patio roof, and then also changed it so that the measurement is to the roof edge rather than what would have formerly been the post or wall. Trying to find examples around the city, these are very rare in the sense. I knew of one that actually was going in, but the air photo wasn't up to date, so I really couldn't show you the best example I know of. But it's one that's just, again, clarifying what patios are and relating that encroachment of the patio in comparison with now having a 20-foot yard or 15 in some cases. Sorry, I'm kind of hoarse.
Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Maxfield? Any neighborhood chairs present who would like to speak to this item? Any members of the community? If not, I'll look to the commissioners for a motion on this item. Mr. Jones.
I move that we forward a positive recommendation for item 4 as described in the staff report.
Do we have a second?
I second the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Anderson. All those in favor?
Aye.
Right, so that is unanimous. So we will forward a positive recommendation on item number 4 to the municipal council. Okay, the last item on our agenda tonight, item 5, excuse me, is a request to reconsider Tyson Barker's request for project plan approval for a charter school at approximately 1792 South State Street in the A 1.5 and R 1.6 zones in the Spring Creek neighborhood. And Dustin Wright will present this.
Thank you. So this item that's being requested for reconsideration tonight is an item that you heard at the last Planning Commission meeting, where public comments and discussion were had at that hearing, and the applicant wasn't present to address those questions and comments. And so there were things such as parking and grading and drainage that weren't able to be addressed and have the Planning Commission's concerns addressed. And so the item was denied at that hearing. The Planning Commission bylaws allow for a reconsideration of an item from a previous agenda. And so the community development staff is requesting that this item be brought back at the next Planning Commission hearing, which would be July 12th, to be reconsidered at that meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Wright. Any comments or questions for Mr. Wright from the commissioners? If not, I'll look for a motion. Mr. Smith.
Man, yeah, I mean, we can make the same decision next time this comes on the agenda if we make a motion for this to come on. If the person doesn't show, if questions aren't answered and things like that. So I guess there's no harm in putting it on again unless it makes number like 25 on the agenda. But I'll make a motion to reconsider the project plan approval for the charter school. Item 5.
I second the motion.
Seconded by Mr. Anderson. All those in favor?
Aye.
So item number 5 is approved by the Planning Commission unanimously, and we will then plan to see this on the agenda at the next hearing on July the 12th. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Seconded.
Seconded by Mr. Anderson. Thank you.
Vote on it.